Welcome to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today's topic is 3.1 Biodiversity and Evolution. We're going to explore how the natural processes of evolution have led to the incredible diversity of life forms on Earth, how we measure this biodiversity, and why maintaining it is so critical for ecological systems. Let's begin by understanding what biodiversity actually means. Biodiversity is the total diversity of living systems on Earth, and it exists at several distinct levels. The biodiversity levels are habitat diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. Each of these levels plays a unique role in maintaining healthy ecosystems. When we talk about biodiversity conservation, we need to be clear about which level we're addressing, because different strategies may be required for different levels. Let's look at these three levels in more detail. Habitat diversity refers to the variety of habitats and ecosystems present in a region or around the world. Species diversity concerns the number and variety of species living within those habitats. And genetic diversity refers to the variety of genes and alleles within a species or population. These levels are interconnected. Ecosystem diversity is considered the broadest form of biodiversity. The more ecosystems you have, the more habitats there are. And the more habitats there are, the greater the variety of species that might live there. The components of diversity contribute to the resilience of ecological systems. Resilience refers to an ecosystem's ability to recover from disturbances and maintain its essential functions despite challenges. Biodiversity is really important for this resilience. When an ecosystem has greater diversity at all three of those levels, it has more options for responding to changes and disturbances. This food web demonstrates why resilience is linked to complexity. The more complex an ecosystem's food web is, the more resilient it becomes. When many species are present with multiple feeding relationships, the loss of a single species doesn't typically collapse the entire system. There are alternative pathways for energy to flow. For example, if one predator declines, other predators can step in to fill that ecological role. This redundancy within the system creates stability through diversity. Biodiversity arises from evolutionary processes. Evolution is defined as cumulative change in the heritable characteristics of a population or species. These changes occur over time as organisms adapt to their environments through natural selection. In this image, you can see how different species of birds evolved from a common ancestor. Each bird species developed specialized beaks suited to specific food sources in its environment. This specialization resulted from different selective pressures in each of those environments. Looking at evolution more precisely, it represents cumulative change that builds up over time in the heritable characteristics of a population or a species. The heritable characteristics part is really important. Evolution works through changes in gene and allele frequency in a population's gene pool. These genetic changes are passed from one generation to the next. And the timeline at the bottom shows how human evolution has occurred over millions of years, with climate and environmental changes influencing the process because they change the selective pressures over time. Natural selection is the mechanism that drives evolutionary change. First proposed by Charles Darwin, natural selection explains how populations adapt to their environments over time. The process requires variation among individuals, some advantage conferred by certain variations, and the inheritance of those advantageous traits. Through this process, organisms become better adapted to their environments, and that leads to the incredible diversity of life we see on Earth today. Natural selection operates continuously and can take place over billions of years. The diagram on the left shows how mutation creates variation, with favorable mutations being more likely to survive and reproduce. The illustration on the right shows a concrete example with mice and owls. Initially, light-colored mice are more visible to predators and get eaten more often, while the dark-furred mice have better survival rates because they're able to hide. Over time, the population shifts towards a higher proportion of dark-furred mice because more of them survive to reproduce. Looking at human evolution specifically, we can see how natural selection has shaped our species over millions of years. This timeline illustrates major developments in human evolution, showing how adaptations occurred in response to environmental conditions. For instance, when our ancestors moved from forests to grasslands, they developed bipedal locomotion, that's walking on 2 feet, as an adaptation to this new environment. To truly understand evolution by natural selection, you have to be able to connect changes in Earth's physical environments to the life forms that arose and thrived at those different times. This timeline shows how major geological and climate events have influenced the evolution of life on Earth. For example, The great oxidation event around 2.4 billion years ago dramatically changed Earth's atmosphere, making it possible for oxygen-dependent organisms to evolve. Each major transition in Earth's history opened a new evolutionary possibility. Evolution by natural selection involves four key components working together. First, variation within a population provides diverse traits that may prove advantageous. Second, overproduction means that more offspring are produced than can survive and be supported by available resources. Third, competition for those limited resources means that not all individuals are going to survive to reproduce. And fourth, differences in adaptation affect survival and reproduction rates, with better adapted individuals able to pass on their genes to the next generation of offspring. This diagram illustrates the four principles of natural selection. First, variation resulting from genetic diversity. Notice the different colored beetles. Second, overproduction means that more offspring are produced than the environment can support. Third, selection occurs as competition limits survival. Here, the birds are selectively eating certain beetles and not eating others as often. Finally, the surviving organisms reproduce and pass on their genes that conferred those survival advantages. Over time, this leads to a population with more individuals possessing the advantageous traits. Here's another illustration of natural selection using mice in a grassland environment. In the top row, you can see that there's variation in population with different colored mice. Predators like birds are more likely to spot and capture the lighter colored mice against a brown background. Over time, the darker mice that blend better with their environment have higher survival rates, and therefore they reproduce more often, passing on their genes for dark fur. Eventually, the whole population evolves to have predominantly dark-colored individuals. Speciation is the generation of new species through evolution. This is how one species can diverge into two or more distinct species over time. Speciation typically occurs when populations become isolated from each other, and that prevents gene flow between those populations. As these separated populations adapt to their different environments through natural selection, they eventually become so different that they can no longer interbreed, even if they're brought back together. This diagram shows how geographic isolation leads to speciation. Restarting with an original population with genetic and phenotypic or physical variation. The population becomes split by a geographic barrier such as a mountain range or a river. In isolation, the separated populations experience different environmental conditions that exert selection pressures to favor different characteristics. Over time, that natural selection causes each population to diverge genetically until they become distinct species unable to interbreed successfully. Here, you can see speciation in African cichlid fishes, one of the most remarkable examples of rapid evolutionary diversification. What's fascinating is that many species of cichlid in Lakes Victoria, Tanganyika, and Malawi evolved from a single common ancestor. Through geographic isolation in different lakes and adaptation to different ecological niches within those lakes, hundreds of unique species have evolved, each with specialized feeding strategies and behaviors. Note that this process occurred over many millions of years. The cichlid example demonstrates how a single ancestral species can diversify into many distinct species through a process called adaptive radiation. Species diversity in communities is a product of richness and evenness. These two components work together to determine the overall diversity of a biological community. Richness refers simply to the number of different species that are present in an area. Evenness, on the other hand, describes how similar the population sizes are across all of those species. Both of these factors are important parts for measuring biodiversity. This diagram visually shows the concepts of richness and evenness. We can compare low richness in A with the high richness in B. Area A has only two species, red and blue squares, while area B has many different species represented by different colors. We can compare low species evenness in area C with high species evenness in area D. C has low evenness because one species, the yellow squares, dominates the whole population, while area D has a more balanced distribution among its many species. For maximum diversity, an ecosystem needs both high richness and high evenness. Simpson's reciprocal index is used to provide a quantitative measure of species diversity, and that allows different ecosystems to be compared and for change in a specific ecosystem over time to be measured and monitored. This mathematical tool combines both richness and evenness into a single numerical value, and that makes it easier to compare biodiversity across different locations or to track changes in biodiversity over time at a single location due to human activities. You aren't required to memorize the formula for Simpson's reciprocal index in ESS. On the exam, you're going to be given this formula. You may have to explain what different parts of it mean, and you might be asked to use it to calculate diversity in different areas, but you don't have to memorize it. Knowledge of global and regional biodiversity is necessary for the development of effective management strategies to conserve biodiversity. Without accurate information about which species exist where, their population numbers, and trends over time, conservation efforts are going to be useless. They're ineffective. This knowledge allows conservationists to prioritize areas and species for protection based on their ecological importance and their level of threat. We'll get into that a little bit more in the next topic in our syllabus. Citizen science projects are increasingly important tools for gathering biodiversity data locally. Programs like eBird, Globe at Night, FrogWatch, and iNaturalist allow ordinary people to contribute valuable scientific observations. These projects serve multiple purposes. They collect data on species distributions and abundance, they monitor environmental change over time, and they engage the public in conservation efforts. Local data informs the priorities set by local and regional authorities and conservation organizations. And it also enables comparison with other locations to monitor larger scale trends. Additionally, local experts called parabiologists often have more detailed knowledge of local ecosystems that distant scientific experts might lack. And that makes those parabiologists really valuable contributors to conservation management. That's it for the standard level content of ESS Topic 3.1, Biodiversity and Evolution. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe and share. And until next time, happy learning. Welcome to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today's topic is the SL content for 3.2, Human Impact on Biodiversity. In this video, we're going to examine how human activities are affecting biological diversity across the planet. We'll investigate both direct and indirect threats to biodiversity, discuss how invasive species disrupt ecosystems, learn about conservation status classifications, and explore why common resources often face unsustainable exploitation. Let's get into it. Biological diversity is being adversely affected by both direct and indirect human influences. Direct threats specifically target individual species like overharvesting, poaching, and the illegal pet trade. These activities intentionally remove organisms from their natural habitats for human use or profit. Indirect threats, on the other hand, impact many species simultaneously through broader environmental changes. These include things like habitat loss, where forests are cleared for agriculture or development, climate change caused by greenhouse gas emissions, various forms of pollution like plastic waste and chemical runoff, and the introduction of invasive alien species that disrupt native ecosystems. Overharvesting occurs when humans extract resources faster than natural populations can recover. A classic example that we've already studied in ESS is the North Atlantic cod fishery collapse in the 1990s. For centuries, these waters supported abundant cod populations, but industrial fishing technologies led to massive harvests beginning in the middle of the 20th century. By 1992, fish populations had declined by 90% from historical levels. This dramatic collapse demonstrates how quickly overharvesting can devastate a population when it exceeds the species' reproductive capacity. Poaching is the illegal hunting and capture of wildlife, and poaching threatens many species with extinction. Elephants are killed for their ivory tusks, pangolins are killed for their scales that are used in traditional medicine, tigers for their skin and bones, and rhinos for their horns. Wildlife trafficking has become a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise around the world. The impacts extend beyond just population declines. Poaching often targets the largest or healthiest individuals, which disrupts breeding patterns and reduces genetic diversity in the remaining population. The illegal wildlife trade operates through complex international networks. This map shows the main international routes for trafficking great apes. Species are typically captured in biodiversity-rich regions like Central Africa. Then they're transported through major transit hubs and sold in markets across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. This global trafficking network demonstrates how consumer demand in one part of the world can drive species extinction in another part of the world. The illegal pet trade threatens biodiversity by removing animals from their natural habitats for the exotic pet market. This trade targets birds, primates, and reptiles valued for their rarity or their appearance. Beyond reducing wild populations, this trade undermines legitimate conservation efforts and international protection agreements like CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. When animals are removed from their ecosystems, it disrupts natural population dynamics and can trigger cascading effects throughout the rest of the food web. Habitat loss represents one of the most significant indirect threats to biodiversity. When natural environments are degraded or destroyed, countless species lose their homes. This map shows the dramatic reduction in orangutan habitat on Borneo between 1930 and 2004. Agricultural expansion, particularly the palm oil plantations, has fragmented the remaining forest. When habitats are fragmented, populations become isolated from one another. That means that then genetic diversity decreases and species become more vulnerable to other threats like disease and climate change. Climate change poses a unique threat to biodiversity because species must either adapt, migrate, or face extinction. This map shows regions where biomes would need to shift at least 1 kilometer per year to keep pace with changing climate patterns. Remember, plants can't get up and move the way animals can. So that means they have to move simply by dispersing their seeds and regrowing farther and farther from their native range. Climate change alters temperature and precipitation patterns, forcing species to adjust their ranges. It disrupts migration and breeding cycles, it increases extreme weather events, and particularly threatens species that can't adapt quickly enough to these rapid changes. Pollution damages habitats and directly harms organisms in numerous ways. Ocean plastic pollution has become particularly problematic, with microplastics now found throughout marine food webs. These tiny plastic fragments attract and concentrate other pollutants, and that enhances their toxicity. Through bioaccumulation and biomagnification, these pollutants become more concentrated at higher trophic levels. When consumed by marine animals, these contaminated microplastics release toxins that damage tissues and disrupt physiological functions, and that ultimately reduces biodiversity. This diagram illustrates how microplastics contribute to persistent organic pollutant toxicity through bioaccumulation and biomagnification. It starts with sorption, which is where pollutants attach to tiny microplastic particles. When marine organisms eat, they ingest these particles, and the toxins are then released into their digestive systems. These persistent compounds then accumulate in tissues over time. That's bioaccumulation. As predators consume multiple contaminated prey, toxin concentrations increase dramatically at higher trophic levels, a process called biomagnification because the toxin concentration gets magnified at higher trophic levels. This biomagnification process means that top predators like sharks, tuna, and marine mammals experience the most severe toxic effects. Invasive alien species can alter existing ecosystem dynamics by completely transforming habitats and driving native species towards extinction. Invasive species reduce local biodiversity by outcompeting native species for limited resources. Without natural predators or pathogens to limit their growth, invasive populations can expand really rapidly. For example, the North American red-clawed crayfish has invaded waterways in the UK and Australia, displacing native crayfish species. Invasive species can also introduce new diseases and parasites that native species haven't evolved defenses against, and that causes the native populations to decline. This map shows invasive marine species hotspots around the world. The highest concentrations appear along major shipping routes and in areas with busy ports. This pattern reflects one of the main pathways for invasive species. When vessels take on water in one port and discharge it in another, they transport numerous marine organisms across oceans. Other invasion pathways include deliberate introductions for agriculture or for the pet trade. Climate change is exacerbating this problem by making previously inhospitable regions suitable for new invasive species. Most ecosystems face multiple human impacts at the same time. These pressures interact and amplify each other's effects. Let's examine how 5 major human impacts interact. Deforestation drastically reduces biodiversity and disrupts water regulation services. The disruption in water regulation can contribute to desertification, the spread of dry, unproductive landscapes driven by deforestation, overgrazing, and poor irrigation practices. Climate change from human activities accelerates these processes and creates conditions where invasive species can thrive because of the disruptions to the established ecosystem dynamics. As ecologically productive land becomes more and more stressed, overharvesting removes key species from ecosystems, further reducing resilience. All these impacts reinforce one another, creating positive feedback loops that accelerate biodiversity loss. That's it for the first part of our video on 3.2, Human Impacts on Biodiversity. In our next video, we're going to take a look at IUCN categories and their criteria. We're going to examine stakeholder perspectives on conservation and explore some case studies of extinct, threatened, and recovered species. Until next time, happy learning. Welcome back to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. This is part 2 of our exploration of ESS topic 3.2, Human Impacts on Biodiversity. In this video, we'll examine how scientists classify species according to their extinction risk, and we're going to explore conservation efforts around the world. So let's get into it. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, assesses the global conservation status of species through its famous Red List. This assessment system standardizes how we evaluate extinction risk based on scientific criteria. These criteria include population size, the rate that population size changes, breeding potential, geographic range, and known threats to that species. The IUCN status provides valuable information that allows governments, conservation organizations, and individuals to prioritize protection efforts and develop appropriate management strategies. The IUCN Red List has grown substantially since its creation. As you can see in this graph, assessments have increased from just 34 species in 1959 to over 157,000 species in 2023. This dramatic increase reflects both growing conservation concern and improved scientific capabilities. However, it's important to note that this represents only a tiny fraction of all known species. Many taxonomic groups remain poorly studied, especially invertebrates, fungi, and plants. The growing assessment database helps identify patterns of extinction risk across different regions and taxonomic groups. The IUCN Red List uses these color-coded categories to classify species based on their risk of extinction. This system creates a standardized way to communicate how threatened a species is. The categories range from least concern in blue-green to extinct in black, with increasing levels of threat as we move through the spectrum. These classifications help conservationists decide where to focus their limited resources and track how species are responding to protection efforts. Let's look at the first two categories. Species labeled least concern are widespread and abundant. These animals and plants face no immediate risk of extinction because they have large, stable populations and they don't face significant threats. Think of common birds like robins or pigeons. Near-threatened species are doing okay for now, but they are showing some warning signs. They're experiencing some population declines or facing new emerging threats. They're not yet threatened, but they could become so in the near future if we don't monitor them carefully. The American bison is one example. Their populations have increased, but they do remain vulnerable to future threats. Moving into the threatened categories, we see a progression of risk. Vulnerable species face a high risk of extinction in the wild if current conditions continue. They've experienced significant population declines or habitat loss. Endangered species face an even higher risk with rapidly shrinking populations or very limited ranges. The African elephant is endangered because poaching continues to reduce its numbers drastically. Critically endangered represents the highest risk category before extinction. These species are in immediate danger of disappearing forever. They often have tiny populations and they face multiple serious threats at the same time. The final categories represent complete failure of conservation efforts. Extinct in the wild means a species survives only in captivity, in zoos, in aquariums, or in botanical gardens. The wild population has completely vanished, as happened with the Hawaiian crow. Extinct is the final, irreversible category. No individuals remain anywhere on Earth. The dodo bird and the passenger pigeon are classic examples of extinct species. Once a species reaches this point, its unique genetic information and ecological role are lost forever. Conservation status helps different stakeholders decide where to focus their efforts. Different groups approach conservation from unique perspectives. National governments establish protected areas and pass laws to protect species. NGOs run research programs, breeding centers, and advocacy campaigns. Individual citizens make choices about consumption, they participate in citizen science, and they may support local conservation initiatives. Each group has different resources and priorities, but they all play crucial roles in protecting biodiversity. Governments typically approach conservation by balancing economic development with environmental protection. They create national parks, enforce wildlife laws, and represent their countries in international agreements. However, they often face political and economic pressures that limit conservation actions. Brazil's approach to the Amazon rainforest illustrates this challenge. The government has to balance the economic benefits of development with the ecological importance of preserving the world's largest rainforest. This balancing act shows how economic interests often compete with conservation goals. Non governmental organizations focus primarily on ecosystem preservation. They have more flexibility than governments in their approaches and their funding models. Groups like the WWF use scientific research to guide conservation strategies, and they often highlight charismatic species like pandas to gain public support. NGOs can mobilize international resources and public awareness through campaigns, through research, and through direct conservation action. Their focus on specific species and habitats often creates more targeted conservation programs than government efforts can. Individual citizens connect with conservation through emotional attachments to specific animals or natural places. Our perspectives are shaped by cultural values and personal experiences. For a refresher on how people's perspectives are shaped, watch my video about environmental value systems. While we may have limited resources compared to governments or NGOs, individuals often engage in direct conservation actions like habitat restoration or wildlife monitoring. On the flip side, people may not engage in conservation efforts because of their economic situation or because they prioritize human wants and needs over natural ecosystems. People are frequently motivated by aesthetic or recreational connections to nature. Individual activists have played important roles in protecting species like the golden lion tamarin by raising awareness and changing public opinion about conservation priorities. Conservation often involves conflicts between different stakeholders' priorities. In the Amazon rainforest, government perspectives might emphasize economic development through resource extraction for the Brazilian voters who brought them to power, while NGOs focus on ecosystem protection and indigenous rights, and they have pressure from external sources outside of Brazil. Individual perspectives might value biodiversity preservation and cultural heritage. These differences create tensions between economic development and ecological preservation, short-term gains versus long-term sustainability, and local community needs versus global conservation goals. Resolving these conflicts requires compromise and understanding of different perspectives. Let's take a look at several species whose case studies demonstrate varying degrees of conservation success or failure. First, let's look at some tragic examples of extinction caused by humans. The passenger pigeon once darkened the skies of North America in flocks of billions of birds. Despite this abundance, market hunting and habitat destruction drove them to extinction by 1914. This case of the passenger pigeon demonstrates how even incredibly numerous species can disappear when we exploit them faster than they can reproduce. The Tasmanian tiger, or thylacine, was a unique marsupial predator with a wolf-like appearance. It was systematically hunted due to perceived threats to livestock until the last individual died in captivity in the 1930s. This extinction shows how fear and misunderstanding can lead to the deliberate elimination of species. The Caribbean monk seal disappeared in the 1950s after centuries of hunting for oil and blubber. European colonizers killed these seals in huge numbers, and their entire range in the Caribbean was heavily impacted by human activities. Their extinction left a gap for marine ecosystems throughout the region. Steller's sea cow was a remarkable marine mammal discovered in 1741 in the North Pacific Ocean. Within just 27 years of its scientific discovery, it was hunted to extinction for meat, fat, and hide. This rapid extinction highlights how vulnerable slow reproducing species are to human exploitation. Today, many species face similar threats. The vaquita porpoise is the most endangered marine mammal on Earth, with fewer than 20 individuals remaining in Mexico's Gulf of California. They're caught accidentally in fishing nets that are targeting the valuable totuaba fish. Despite international attention and protection efforts, their population continues to decline. The Javan rhino is restricted to a single population in Indonesia's Ujung Kulon National Park, with fewer than 70 individuals. Poaching for their horns and habitat loss have driven this species to the brink of extinction. Their limited range makes them vulnerable to disease or to natural disasters. The Amur leopard is one of the world's most endangered big cats, with fewer than 100 individuals in the Russian Far East and northeastern China. Their spotted coats make them targets for poachers, while habitat fragmentation isolates their populations and limits their genetic diversity. The kakapo is a flightless parrot found only in New Zealand, and there's only about 200 of them left in the wild. These unusual birds evolved without mammalian predators, which makes them extremely vulnerable to introduced cats and rats. The kakapo's slow reproduction rate, they breed only every 2 to 4 years, makes their recovery particularly challenging. Not all conservation stories end in tragedy. The Arabian oryx once roamed the Arabian Peninsula, but was driven extinct in the wild by 1972 due to hunting. However, through captive breeding programs and reintroduction efforts, several wild populations have been reestablished. Their status has improved from extinct in the wild to vulnerable. That's a remarkable conservation success. The black-footed ferret was declared extinct in the wild in the 1980s after prairie dog populations were decimated, because prairie dogs is the ferret's main source of prey. A small population of the black-footed ferret was discovered, and captive breeding programs have established multiple wild populations since then. While they're still listed as endangered, their numbers are slowly increasing. The Mauritius kestrel's population crashed to just 4 known birds in the wild in the 1970s due to DDT poisoning and habitat loss. Through intensive captive breeding, habitat protection, and predator control, their population has grown to over 400 individuals. This recovery shows how dedicated conservation can save species even from the brink of extinction. The California condor, North America's largest bird, was reduced to just 27 birds when I was a kid in the 1980s. A controversial decision to capture all remaining wild condors for breeding is what saved the species. Today, over 300 condors exist, with more than half of them flying free in the wild. Lead poisoning from ammunition remains a challenge for their full recovery, but their population is growing. The southern white rhino was nearly extinct in the early 1900s, with fewer than 50 of them remaining in South Africa. Protected reserves and anti-poaching efforts have helped the population of white rhinos recover to over 20,000 individuals, making it the only rhino species not endangered today. This success shows that large mammal conservation can work with sufficient protection. These conservation challenges connect to a concept called the tragedy of the commons. This describes what happens when many people have unrestricted access to a shared resource. Since each user gets all the benefits from exploiting the resource but shares the costs with everybody else, individuals are motivated to take as much as possible. This rational individual behavior leads to collective disaster, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. The concept helps explain why shared resources like fisheries, forests, and clean air are often overexploited despite their importance to everybody. The tragedy of the commons operates through a specific mechanism. Benefits go to individual users, while costs are distributed among all users. This creates incentives for overexploitation, and it often triggers feedback loops that accelerate resource depletion. Common resources share key characteristics. Their use reduces availability for others, many users have access, and access is hard to control. This dynamic challenges long-term resource management and creates tension between individual and collective interests. Examples like the Grand Banks cod collapse in the North Atlantic Ocean and Amazon deforestation show how this tragedy continues to unfold today. Human impacts on biodiversity involve complex interactions between direct threats, indirect pressures, and social systems. Understanding these relationships allows us to develop effective conservation strategies. The IUCN Red List helps us track species status and prioritize conservation efforts. Different stakeholders bring different perspectives and resources to conservation work. And by learning from both extinction failures and recovery successes, we can make better decisions about protecting Earth's biodiversity in the future. Until next time, happy learning. Welcome to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today's topic is 3.3, Conservation and Regeneration. We're going to examine the standard level content about conservation strategies and the design principles for establishing protected areas. Let's get into it. Conservation and regeneration represent two complementary approaches to biodiversity protection. Conservation focuses on preserving what already exists, while regeneration aims to restore what's been damaged or lost. Both of these are important parts of environmental management in a changing world. Let's begin by exploring the various arguments used to justify species and habitat preservation. We're going to go through these one by one in just a moment. The arguments can be categorized into 5 main types: aesthetic, ecological, economic, ethical, and social justifications. Each perspective offers important insights into why biodiversity matters. Economic arguments for preservation frequently involve the valuation of ecotourism, genetic resources, and natural capital. Different ecosystems provide distinct ecological services, and that influences their economic value to society. The chart shown here illustrates the enormous value of ecosystem services across various biomes globally, from forests to wetlands and coral reefs. Here's a concrete example of economic justification for conservation from Cambodia. Cambodia's deciduous forests are vital conservation areas in Southeast Asia, and they have really diverse mammal and bird life, but they face threats from deforestation, hunting, and settlement. In 2002, the Cambodian government partnered with a wildlife conservation society to implement payment for ecosystem services schemes. These are called PES schemes. These programs charge tourists for birdwatching experiences, and they pay locals for reporting and protecting threatened species nests. Some communities also participate in the UN Red Plus program, in which they receive financial payments to protect forests. Keeping the forest intact not only provides habitat for biodiversity, it also sequesters carbon to mitigate climate change. These kinds of PES schemes create economic incentives for conservation while supporting local communities. Similarly, tourism offers compelling economic reasons for conservation in East Africa. The region generates over $7 billion a year from tourism across countries like Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Mountain ecosystems featuring trekking, wildlife viewing, and scenic landscapes are major attractions, with Mount Kilimanjaro alone providing more than a third of Tanzania's tourism revenue. In rural areas with limited agricultural options, conservation-based tourism offers really important income source through crafts, guiding, and employment in the hospitality industry. This shows how protecting natural environments can directly benefit local economies and communities. Ecological reasons for conservation often relate to ecosystem services. Pollination is a prime example of this. Insects help crop reproduction, while pollinators maintain plant diversity by spreading their genes around. These animal-plant relationships ensure that successful reproduction happens across ecosystems. Examples include European honeybees pollinating almond orchards, rufous hummingbirds sustaining western wildflowers, and Egyptian fruit bats pollinating baobab trees. Without conservation efforts to protect these pollinators, many plant species and agricultural systems are going to collapse. Water purification represents another important ecological service. Wetlands naturally filter contaminants, forests prevent water pollution, and healthy ecosystems ensure that clean water for human and wildlife consumption is available. The Florida Everglades filter agricultural runoff, oyster reefs clean Chesapeake Bay, and peat bogs purify Scottish Highland watersheds. These ecosystem services would be prohibitively expensive, like ridiculously expensive, to replace with technology. And that makes their conservation economically sensible as well as ecologically vital. Climate regulation is maybe the most globally significant ecological service. Forests absorb carbon dioxide, biodiversity stabilizes climate patterns, and ecosystems regulate atmospheric gases. The Amazon rainforest sequesters huge amounts of CO2. Sphagnum moss holds carbon in bogs, and mangroves protect coastal carbon stocks. These systems provide natural climate solutions that complement technological approaches to addressing climate change. Nutrient cycling represents yet another ecological justification for conservation. Decomposers recycle organic matter, soil organisms maintain fertility, and biodiversity ensures nutrient availability. Earthworms aerate agricultural soils, dung beetles recycle savanna nutrients, and mycorrhizal fungi support forest health. These natural recycling systems maintain ecosystem productivity without requiring human intervention, technology, or economic investment. Disease regulation is often overlooked, but it is critically important. Diverse ecosystems naturally limit pathogens. Predators control disease vectors, and balanced ecosystems prevent outbreaks. Barn owls control rodent populations that might otherwise spread disease. Amphibians eat mosquitoes that can carry pathogens, and coral reef diversity limits marine pathogens. When we disrupt these natural control systems, it leads to disease outbreaks with serious consequences for wildlife and humans alike. Ethical arguments for conservation are diverse and can include reference to the intrinsic or instrumental value of species. Intrinsic value, if you remember back to topic 1, intrinsic value refers to the inherent worth of a species independent of its usefulness to humans. This perspective holds that species have worth regardless of human utility. All life deserves respect and preservation, and biodiversity has value independent of human benefits. Examples include snow leopards deserving protection simply because they exist, Sumatran rhinos having an inherent right to survive, and Amazon river dolphins having value beyond any human benefit that they provide. By contrast, instrumental value refers to the worth of a species based on its usefulness or benefit to humans or ecosystems. This includes bees providing crop pollination services, mangrove forests protecting coastal communities from storms, elephants generating tourism revenue, the Pacific yew trees producing cancer-fighting compounds, wolves regulating prey populations, and vultures preventing diseases spread by consuming carcasses. These values represent the practical benefits that species provide. Understanding different ethical frameworks helps us develop conservation strategies that resonate with different stakeholders and communities. Ecocentric perspectives emphasize intrinsic value and the right of all species to exist. That's the bio rights that we studied back in topic 1. Anthropocentric perspectives focus on instrumental values and benefits to humans. Indigenous perspectives often blend these approaches, seeing people as part of nature with responsibilities towards it. Religious frameworks might view species as divine creations deserving of our stewardship. Rights-based approaches can extend moral consideration to non-human species, while utilitarian approaches can evaluate conservation based on overall welfare outcomes. Social arguments might highlight the importance of ecosystem goods and services for human well-being. Ecosystem goods are tangible resources that are harvested from nature and contribute to human welfare. Examples include Amazon forest providing medicinal plants, the Indian Ocean fisheries feeding coastal communities, and bamboo supplying sustainable building materials. These goods directly support human livelihoods and cultural practices. Ecosystem services encompass processes or functions that are performed by natural systems that support human life and well-being. Wetlands reduce flooding in communities. Urban trees improve mental health. Coral reefs protect coastal infrastructure. These services aren't harvested directly, but they provide essential background functions that our human communities depend on. Additional social arguments for biodiversity include cultural and community benefits, as well as health and security. Baobab trees maintain cultural traditions. Salmon runs sustain indigenous communities, and national parks provide recreation opportunities. Intact ecosystems reduce disease emergence, diverse forests prevent landslides, and green spaces improve urban air quality. All these benefits connect biodiversity to human social systems and our well-being. To summarize the arguments for species and habitat preservation, aesthetic arguments focus on beauty and inspiration derived from diverse species and habitats. Ecological arguments highlight how diverse habitats provide services like erosion control, pollination, and flood prevention. Economic arguments emphasize ecotourism, medicinal compounds, and genetic resources. Ethical arguments consider biorights and obligations to future generations. Social arguments recognize that habitats provide homes, work, resources, and social cohesion for people, particularly indigenous communities. Now let's transition to examining conservation strategies. Species-based conservation tends to involve ex situ strategies, while habitat-based conservation tends to involve in situ strategies. These different approaches serve complementary purposes in biodiversity protection. Ex situ conservation refers to protecting species outside their natural habitats. Ex means out, like in exit and exclude and extraneous. So ex situ is like out of the situation. This species-based approach is particularly valuable for critically endangered species whose habitats have been severely damaged or fragmented. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway exemplifies this approach because it stores plant genetic diversity at really low temperatures to create botanical backup systems that enable future restoration efforts and protect against extinction events, even if some of those ecosystems are wiped out in the meantime. Another example of ex situ conservation is the California condor captive breeding program. This approach enables conservationists to breed endangered species in controlled environments, to maintain genetic diversity carefully, to increase population numbers safely, and to prepare animals for eventual reintroduction to natural ecosystems. This also supports the recovery of wild populations. For some critically endangered species, these programs represent their frankly, their last chance for survival. In situ conservation focuses on protecting species within their natural habitats. In situ translates to in the situation. This habitat-based approach maintains ecological relationships and evolutionary processes while benefiting many different species at the same time. Yellowstone National Park in the US exemplifies this strategy because it conserves ecosystems within natural habitats. It restricts harmful human activities, it protects multiple species at the same time, and it maintains ecological relationships intact, and that allows the natural evolutionary processes to continue. Marine environments also benefit from in situ conservation. The Mafia Island Marine Protected Area in Tanzania demonstrates this approach by regulating fishing and resource extraction, creating underwater wildlife sanctuaries, and implementing zone-based protection systems. This allows marine populations to recover naturally, and it supports sustainable fishing in nearby areas. This balances conservation with human needs. And if you ever get the opportunity to go to Mafia Island and swim with these whale sharks, I highly recommend it. It's wicked cool. Habitat conservation strategies protect species by conserving their natural environment. This might require either protection of wild areas or active management, and that depends on the specific context and the threats that are facing that ecosystem. The amount of protected land worldwide has increased dramatically over time. In 1900, about 125 years ago, only 0.03% of global land was protected. But by 2023, this figure has risen to 17.9%. That's almost a fifth of all of the world's land. This reflects growing awareness of the importance of habitat conservation for biodiversity protection. However, quantity doesn't always equal quality. Effective management is really important for these protected areas so that they can fulfill their purpose of conservation. Serengeti National Park in Tanzania exemplifies the wild area approach to habitat conservation. This huge protected area spans 14,750 square kilometers of savanna, and it maintains complete ecosystem integrity with minimal human intervention. It features limited infrastructure development, big buffer zones around a large core, and significant distance from major urban areas to minimize human disturbance. This approach prioritizes natural processes over human accessibility. By contrast, the Florida Everglades Restoration Project represents an actively managed conservation area. Approximately 5,200 square kilometers in size, this ecosystem needs human intervention through canals and levees to control water flow. People used prescribed burning to maintain fire-dependent habitats, and then hunting and the removal of invasive species like the Burmese python, the reintroduction of native species, land acquisition to connect fragmented habitats, and programs that prevent agricultural runoff and pollution are all required to maintain this ecosystem. That's why it's called active management. Zealandia in New Zealand demonstrates a third approach, pest exclusion fencing to create eco-sanctuaries. This 25-hectare urban sanctuary near downtown Wellington is surrounded by almost 9 kilometers of predator-proof fencing that keeps 14 species of non-native mammals out. This allows endangered native birds like kiwi, takane, and hihi to thrive while demonstrating successful conservation in proximity to urban areas where people can access it and use it for education and building awareness. Effective conservation of biodiversity in nature reserves and national parks depends on understanding the biology of target species and the effect of conservation area size and shape. These design principles greatly influence the success of a conservation area. UNESCO biosphere reserves exemplify thoughtful conservation design with 3 distinct zones. The core zone permits no human activity in the natural ecosystem. It monitors environmental quality and sustainability, and it protects endangered species and habitats. Around the core zone, you have the buffer zone. The buffer zone allows research and educational activities. It permits controlled tourism and recreation, and it manages resources for sustainable production. And the third layer is the transition zone. The transition zone accommodates managed human activities and settlements. It supports ecosystem restoration, and it promotes community collaboration for sustainability. The success of a protected area is linked to its design. Protected area design principles include physical aspects of the area as well as its relationship with surrounding communities. Consider these things when evaluating how well a protected area conserves biodiversity. Size. Bigger is better. Shape. Rounder shapes reduce the edge effect. Fragmentation. Intact reserves are better than those that are disrupted by roads and infrastructure. The number of reserves, because more is better than one, but one is better than none. Connections to other protected areas. This promotes interbreeding and genetic diversity, management, which often includes funding, and human presence, because fewer people generally means fewer disruptions to natural processes, as well as community engagement, because the more surrounding communities stand to gain from a protected area, the more successful that protected area is going to be. Habitat fragmentation poses one of the greatest threats to conservation success. When habitats are divided, interior spaces decrease due to isolation. Edge species increase and alter the ecosystem balance. Roads divide populations and block migration paths, and overall biodiversity and ecosystem resilience decline. Fragmentation disrupts the relationships between species that share a habitat. When natural or human-led events cause a divide in the habitat, some species might become unable to survive because they've been separated from other species that they depend on or that they have a relationship with. This diminishes biodiversity and ecosystem function, and it makes the remaining species more vulnerable or more susceptible to disease and environmental change. Conservation strategies have to address this kind of interconnection in order to be effective. That's it for our video on conservation and regeneration strategies. In our next video, we're going to take a look at several case studies that demonstrate in situ and ex situ conservation strategies. And we're also going to go through an evaluation of several protected areas around the world. Until next time, happy learning. Welcome to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today's focus is ESS Topic 3.3, Conservation and Regeneration. In this video, we're going to examine several key approaches to biodiversity conservation with a particular focus on mixed conservation approaches, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and rewilding as a regeneration strategy. These approaches represent different ways that people attempt to protect and restore biodiversity, and they reflect different environmental perspectives and value systems. So let's get into it. We're going to start with the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. This international agreement represents one of the most significant global frameworks for conservation. The CBD is a UN treaty that addresses both species-based conservation, which focuses on protecting individual species, and habitat-based conservation, which aims to protect entire ecosystems where species live naturally. So what exactly is the CBD? It's an international agreement that helps countries protect nature. It was signed at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. The CBD has three main goals. First, to protect the variety of plants, animals, and ecosystems around the world. Second, to use natural resources in ways that don't harm them for future generations. And third, to make sure the benefits from using genetic resources like plants for medicine are shared fairly. CBD works by helping countries create their own national biodiversity strategies and action plans. It also establishes protected areas in the oceans beyond any country's territory, and that's especially important because international waters usually lack proper protection. A key component of the CBD is the Nagoya Protocol, which makes sure that when companies or researchers use genetic resources like plants with medicinal properties, the benefits are shared fairly with the communities where those resources came from. This prevents something called biopiracy, where local people are excluded from the profits or benefits of their traditional resources. The CBD uses both habitat-based and species-based conservation strategies. For habitat-based conservation, it helps countries create their own national plans to protect nature and establishes protected areas in the oceans beyond any country's territory. For species-based conservation, the Nagoya Protocol allows for the curation of genetic data through methods like captive breeding and seed banks. It ensures that benefits are shared fairly with the communities where those resources originated, and that respects their rights and their knowledge. Let's take a look at mixed conservation approaches. Sometimes a mixed conservation approach is adopted, where both habitat and particular species are considered. This combines the strengths of both in situ conservation, which protects species in their natural habitats, with ex situ conservation, where we're protecting species outside of their natural habitats, such as in zoos or seed banks. We saw that in our previous video. We're going to go through several case studies that demonstrate different approaches to conservation. I recommend you make notes about each of them so that you have named examples to reference on your exams. The Sichuan Giant Panda Reserve in China provide an excellent example of a mixed approach. These reserves protect endangered giant pandas and their bamboo forest habitat. The mixed approach includes large in situ reserves of bamboo forest, captive breeding programs, which are ex situ conservation, and ecological corridors that connect fragmented habitats. This mixed approach stabilizes panda populations, it increases the connectivity of their habitats, and it improves international cooperation. When evaluating this project, you can see successes like the panda's status being upgraded from endangered to vulnerable, successful captive breeding in zoos around the world, and expanded protected areas in China. However, challenges do remain, and that includes habitat fragmentation due to more development of infrastructure and dependence on human intervention or reintroductions. Another example is the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which spans the USA and Canada. This ambitious project connects 3,200 kilometers of protected areas between Yellowstone National Park in the US and the Yukon in Canada. It aims to conserve large-scale wildlife habitats and migration corridors for species like grizzly bears, wolves, and moose. This mixed approach focuses both on habitat preservation and ensuring the survival of specific species through habitat corridors. Benefits include maintaining ecosystem functions, providing species migration routes, and preventing habitat fragmentation. The initiative has seen success in species recovery, such as the grizzly bear population increasing, but it faces challenges like human-wildlife conflict and ensuring the long-term viability of the corridors, especially when there's an extensive road network in both of those places. The Galapagos Islands Conservation Program in Ecuador showcases another mixed approach. Famous for its unique biodiversity, the Galapagos Islands conservation efforts here focus on both protecting the habitat and ensuring the survival of iconic species such as the Galapagos tortoise. The mixed approach includes invasive species removal, habitat restoration, and breeding programs for endangered species like the tortoises. Benefits include biodiversity conservation, reduced human impact, and the restoration of critical habitats. An evaluation shows successful management of invasive species, but challenges remain in the recovery of endemic species and balancing the demands of tourism that funds it with the actual purpose, which is conservation. The African Elephant Conservation Program across sub-Saharan Africa demonstrates how several countries have adopted mixed conservation strategies for elephants. The approach combines habitat protection through national parks and reserves with efforts to reduce human-elephant conflict, anti-poaching measures, and community engagement. Benefits include long-term elephant survival, reduced human-wildlife conflict, and improved community relationships. Successes include decreased poaching rates, better community-based conservation, effectiveness of habitat corridors, and improved awareness of elephant value beyond ivory. Challenges, of course, include ongoing poaching for ivory, ineffective governance and monitoring, and human population pressure on protected sites. The Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation in Indonesia and Malaysia works on the conservation of the critically endangered Bornean orangutan. Their approach combines habitat restoration with the protection of individual orangutans. The mixed approach includes rehabilitation of orphaned orangutans and restoration of degraded forests. Benefits include species recovery, ecosystem restoration, and slower deforestation rates. While there has been success in orangutan population recovery and some forest restoration, there are big challenges combating illegal logging and powerful timber companies because the economic benefit of habitat loss usually outweighs that gained from conservation efforts. Kakadu National Park conservation in Australia provides another example of mixed approach to conservation. This UNESCO World Heritage Site has rich biodiversity, particularly for species like the saltwater crocodile, the Jabiru stork, and various marine life. The mixed approach combines habitat protection, the conservation of key species, and the involvement of indigenous communities in its management. Benefits include preservation of biodiversity and cultural heritage and improved management through indigenous knowledge. Successes include managing invasive species like the buffalo, the effectiveness of community-based management, and species recovery. Challenges include difficult access, which limits ecotourism opportunities, and ongoing socioeconomic development issues within Aboriginal communities. The Masai Mara conservancies in Kenya support diverse megafauna, including lions, elephants, and wildebeest. Wildlife migration corridors link to the Serengeti in Tanzania. Community conservancies combine habitat conservation with targeted species protection, such as lion monitoring. Local Maasai communities are involved in conservation tourism. Benefits include economic support for indigenous communities, the protection of key migration routes, and increased funding through ecotourism. This approach has led to stable lion populations, reductions in poaching, and improved habitat conditions, although some challenges remain with land use conflicts and uneven revenue distribution between the government, the private partnerships, and the Maasai communities. The monarch butterfly biosphere reserve in Mexico protects the wintering grounds of millions and millions of migrating monarch butterflies. This mixed approach includes conservation of forests for habitat protection and enforcement against illegal logging and community-based ecotourism. Benefits include maintaining the butterfly migration cycles, supporting local livelihoods, and fostering international conservation efforts. Deforestation rates within the reserve have declined, and an awareness of butterfly conservation has also increased. However, climate change threatens migration patterns and deforestation continues outside the core protected areas. Rhino conservation in southern Africa, particularly South Africa, addresses the severe threat to white and black rhino populations from poaching for their horns. The mixed approach includes anti-poaching patrols, rhino dehorning to reduce poaching incentives, and habitat protection through national parks. Benefits include stabilized rhino populations in some regions and better security in private reserves. Some rhino populations are recovering now, and new technology like drones helps in conservation. However, poaching remains a pretty serious threat, and there are really high costs that are associated with a bunch of these anti-poaching efforts. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Conservation in Australia protects the world's largest coral reef ecosystem, which is home to thousands of marine species. The mixed approach includes habitat protection through marine protected areas and restoration projects for key species like coral breeding programs. Benefits include maintaining marine biodiversity, supporting sustainable tourism and fisheries, and promoting climate resilience. While there are strong legal protections and promising coral restoration projects, the reef does face significant challenges from coral bleaching due to climate change and pollution from coastal development and agriculture. Now let's shift our focus to rewilding. Natural processes and ecosystems can be regenerated by rewilding, which is a conservation approach focused on restoring and protecting natural processes in wilderness areas, allowing them to function without significant human intervention. Rewilding is different from regeneration because regeneration usually involves some kind of human intervention to promote or support a particular part of an ecosystem. This rewilding diagram illustrates how rewilding addresses the global environmental emergency. The current problem shows a massive loss of biodiversity and climate change. Key drivers of that loss include human resource use, loss of natural habitats, rising pressure inside natural areas, and loss of natural processes, as well as release of greenhouse gases. The solution is to restore large areas to high functional value for biodiversity through rewilding. The outcome includes enhanced, resilient capacity for biodiversity across large areas and substantial increases in carbon sequestration. That means we make ecosystems and populations more resilient and more resistant to change and better able to recover from human interference. The ultimate goal is global ecological sustainability, which maintains Earth's biodiversity and simultaneously reduces climate change. The Hinawai Reserve in New Zealand provides an excellent example of rewilding. This project targets native forest regeneration, including tree ferns and podocarps, while supporting native bird species like bellbirds and caribou. Methods include the cessation or blocking of livestock grazing and logging, natural reforestation, the control of invasive species, and minimal human intervention. Successes include rapid natural regeneration of native vegetation, the return of many native bird species, and overall an increase in biodiversity. Some of the limitations include ongoing challenges with invasive species and initial skepticism from the local farming community. The Hinawai is kind of like a biodiversity island surrounded by farmland. The Yellowstone National Park Rewilding Project in the USA targeted the gray wolf as an apex predator to restore ecosystem balance. Methods included reintroducing the wolves to control elk population, and that led to trophic cascades that had effects benefiting vegetation, beavers, other species, and even the flow of water within Yellowstone. Successes included increased biodiversity, healthier riparian zones along those rivers, and the resurgence of species like beavers and songbirds. Some of the limitations include continued human-wildlife conflict because farmers and ranchers outside of the park view the wolves as predators for their livestock, and so they exert political resistance. And there's also some slow ecosystem recovery in some areas. Carafren Wildwood in Scotland focuses on native woodland restoration in the southern uplands and the reintroduction of missing species such as red squirrels and raptors. Methods include cessation of sheep farming, that means they stopped farming sheep, a large-scale tree planting operation, and habitat connectivity improvement. The before and after images here show 22 years of progress through rewilding. Successes include rapid afforestation or growth of forest, improved biodiversity, and increased community involvement in conservation efforts. Some of the limitations include the long timescale for full forest restoration and dependence on active management to prevent the reappearance of invasive species. Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique targets large herbivores like elephants and buffalo, apex predators like lions, and overall savanna ecosystem recovery. Methods include the reintroduction of key species, anti-poaching efforts, and community involvement in conservation. Successes include significant increase in wildlife populations, local employment through ecotourism, and improved overall ecosystem health. Some of the limitations include ongoing challenges around poaching, habitat degradation due to climate change, and a continued need for human intervention to maintain that progress. Finally, the European bison rewilding in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania focuses on the European bison. Methods include the reintroduction of bison into their former range, efforts to connect their habitat, and educating local communities. Successes include growing wild bison populations, increased ecosystem resilience, and benefits from ecotourism. Some of the limitations include a risk of human-wildlife conflict, concerns about genetic diversity within the bison populations, and reliance on continued funding. That's it for ESS Topic 3.3, Conservation and Regeneration. These case studies demonstrate how a combination of species-based ex situ strategies and habitat-based in situ strategies, such as rewilding, can effectively conserve biodiversity and promote ecosystem regeneration. Make sure you remember details about at least a few of these case studies as you prepare for your exams. Until next time, happy learning.